Roughing It in the Bush by Susanna Moodie. Chapter 25. The Walk to Dummer. We trod a weary path through silent woods, tangled and dark, unbroken by a sound of cheerful life. The melancholy shriek of hollow winds careering o'er the snow, or tossing into waves the green pine tops, making the ancient forest groan and sigh beneath their mocking voice, awoke alone the solitary echoes of the place. Reader, have you ever heard of a place situated in the forest depths of this far western wilderness called Dummer? 10 years ago it might not inaptly have been termed the last clearing in the world, nor to this day do I know of any in that direction which extends beyond it. Our bush farm was situated on the border line of a neighbouring township, only 1 degree less wild, less out of the world, or nearer to the habitations of civilization than the far-famed English line, the boast and glory of this terra incognita. This place, so named by the emigrants who had pitched their tents in that solitary wilderness, was a long line of cleared land, extending upon either side for some miles through the darkest and most interminable forest. The English line was inhabited chiefly by Cornish miners, who, tired of burrowing like moles underground, had determined to emigrate to Canada, where they could breathe the fresh air of heaven and obtain the necessaries of life upon the bosom of their mother earth. Strange as it may appear, these men made good farmers and steady, industrious colonists, working as well above ground as they had toiled in their early days beneath it. All our best servants came from Dummer, and although they spoke a language difficult to be understood, and were uncouth in their manners and appearance, they were faithful and obedient, performing the tasks assigned to them with patient perseverance, good food and kind treatment rendering them always cheerful and contented. My dear old Jenny, that most faithful and attached of all humble domestic friends, came from Dummer, and I was wont to regard it with complacency for her sake. But Jenny was not English. She was a generous, warm-hearted daughter of the Green Isle, the emerald gem set in the silver of ocean. Yes, Jenny was one of the poorest children of that impoverished but glorious country where wit and talent seem indigenous, springing up spontaneously in the rudest and most uncultivated minds, showing what the land could bring forth in its own strength, unaided by education, and unfettered by the conventional rules of society. Jenny was a striking instance of the worth, noble self-denial, and devotion which are often met with and, alas, but too often disregarded, in the poor and ignorant natives of that deeply injured and much abused land. A few words about my old favourite may not prove uninteresting to my readers. Jenny Buchanan, or as she called it, Bohannan, was the daughter of a petty exciseman of Scotch extraction, hence her industry, who, at the time of her birth, resided near the old town of Inniskillen. Her mother died a few months after she was born, and her father, within the 12 months, married again. In the meanwhile, the poor orphan babe had been adopted by a kind neighbour, the wife of a small farmer in the vicinity. In return for coarse food and scanty clothing, the little Jenny became a servant of all work. She fed the pigs, herded the cattle, assisted in planting potatoes and digging peat from the bog, and was undisputed mistress of the poultry yard. As she grew up to womanhood, the importance of her labours increased. A better reaper in the harvest field, or footer of turf in the bog, could not be found in the district, or a woman more thoroughly acquainted with the management of cows and the rearing of young cattle, but here poor Jenny's accomplishments terminated. Her usefulness was all abroad. Within the house she made more dirt than she had the inclination or the ability to clear away. She could neither read, nor knit, nor sew, and although she called herself a Protestant, and a Church of England woman, she knew no more of religion as revealed to man through the word of God, than the savage who sinks to the grave in ignorance of a Redeemer. Hence she stoutly resisted all ideas of being a sinner, or of standing the least chance of receiving hereafter the condemnation of one. "Och, sure thin," she would say, with simple earnestness of look and manner, almost irresistible. "God will never trouble himself about a poor hard-working crathur like me, who never did any harm to the meanest of his making." One thing was certain, that a benevolent Providence had troubled himself about poor Jenny in times past, for the warm heart of this neglected child of nature contained a stream of the richest benevolence, which, situated as she had been, could not have been derived from any other source. Honest, faithful, and industrious, Jenny became a law unto herself, and practically illustrated the golden rule of her blessed Lord, to do unto others as we would they should do unto us. She thought it was impossible that her poor services could ever repay the debt of gratitude that she owed to the family who had brought her up, although the obligation must have been entirely on their side. To them she was greatly attached, for them she toiled unceasingly, and when evil days came, and they were not able to meet the rent day or to occupy the farm, she determined to accompany them in their emigration to Canada, and formed one of the stout-hearted band that fixed its location in the lonely and unexplored wilds now known as the township of Dummer. During the first year of their settlement, the means of obtaining the common necessaries of life became so precarious that, in order to assist her friends with the little ready money, Jenny determined to hire out into some wealthy house as a servant. When I use the term wealth as applied to any bush settler, it is of course only comparatively, but Jenny was anxious to obtain a place with settlers who enjoyed a small income independent of their forest means. Her first speculation was a complete failure. For 5 long, hopeless years she served a master from whom she never received a farthing of her stipulated wages. Still her attachment to the family was so strong, and had become so much the necessity of her life, that the poor creature could not make up her mind to leave them. The children whom she had received into her arms at their birth, and whom she had nursed with maternal tenderness, were as dear to her as if they had been her own. She continued to work for them, although her clothes were worn to tatters, and her own friends were too poor to replace them. Her master, Captain N., a handsome, dashing officer, who had served many years in India, still maintained the carriage and appearance of a gentleman, in spite of his mental and moral degradation, arising from a constant state of intoxication. He still promised to remunerate at some future day her faithful services, and although all his neighbours well knew that his means were exhausted, and that that day would never come, yet Jenny, in the simplicity of her faith, still toiled on, in the hope that the better day he spoke of would soon arrive. And now a few words respecting this master, which I trust may serve as a warning to others. Allured by the bait that has been the ruin of so many of his class, the offer of a large grant of land, Captain N. had been induced to form a settlement in this remote and untried township, laying out much, if not all, of his available means in building a log house and clearing a large extent of barren and stony land. To this uninviting home he conveyed a beautiful young wife and a small and increasing family. The result may be easily anticipated. The want of society, a dreadful want to a man of his previous habits, the absence of all the comforts and decencies of life, produced inaction, apathy, and at last despondency, which was only alleviated by a constant and immoderate use of ardent spirits. As long as Captain N. retained his half pay, he contrived to exist. In an evil hour he parted with this, and quickly trod the downhill path to ruin. And here I would remark that it is always a rash and hazardous step for any officer to part with his half pay, although it is almost every day done, and generally followed by the same disastrous results. A certain income, however small, in a country where money is so hard to be procured, and where labour cannot be obtained but at a very high pecuniary remuneration, is invaluable to a gentleman unaccustomed to agricultural employment, who, without this reserve to pay his people during the brief but expensive seasons of seed time and harvest, must either work himself or starve. I have known no instance in which such sale has been attended with ultimate advantage, but alas, too many in which it has terminated in the most distressing destitution. These government grants of land to half-pay officers have induced numbers of this class to emigrate to the backwoods of Canada, who are totally unfit for pioneers, but, tempted by the offer of finding themselves landholders of what, on paper, appear to them fine estates, they resign a certainty to waste their energies and die half-starved and broken-hearted in the depths of the pitiless wild. If a gentleman so situated would give up all idea of settling on his grant, but hire a good farm in a favourable situation, that is, not too far from a market, and with his half-pay hire efficient labourers, of which plenty are now to be had, to cultivate the land, with common prudence and economy, he would soon obtain a comfortable subsistence for his family. And if the males were brought up to share the burthen and heat of the day, the expense of hired labour, as it yearly diminished, would add to the general means and well-being of the whole, until the hired farm became the real property of the industrious tenants. But the love of show, the vain boast of appearing richer and better dressed than our neighbours, too often involves the emigrant's family in debt, from which they are seldom able to extricate themselves without sacrificing the means which would have secured their independence. This, although a long digression, will not, I hope, be without its use, and if this book is regarded not as a work of amusement, but one of practical experience, written for the benefit of others, it will not fail to convey some useful hints to those who have contemplated emigration to Canada, the best country in the world for the industrious and well-principled man, who really comes out to work, and to better his condition by the labour of his hands, but a gulf of ruin to the vain and idle, who only set foot upon these shores to accelerate their ruin. But to return to Captain N. It was at this disastrous period that Jenny entered his service. Had her master adapted his habits and expenditure to his altered circumstances, much misery might have been spared, both to himself and his family. But he was a proud man, too proud to work, or to receive with kindness the offers of service tendered to him by his half-civilised but well-meaning neighbours. "Hang him!" cried an indignant English settler (Captain N was an Irishman), whose offer of drawing wood had been rejected with unmerited contempt. "Wait a few years, and we shall see what his pride will do for him. I am sorry for his poor wife and children, but for himself I have no pity for him." This man had been uselessly insulted at the very moment when he was anxious to perform a kind and benevolent action, when, like a true Englishman, his heart was softened by witnessing the sufferings of a young delicate female and her infant family. Deeply affronted by the captain's foolish conduct, he now took a malignant pleasure in watching his arrogant neighbours progress to ruin. The year after the sale of his commission, Captain N found himself considerably in debt. "Never mind, Ella," he said to his anxious wife, "the crops will pay all." The crops were a failure that year. Creditors pressed hard, the captain had no money to pay his workmen, and he would not work himself. Disgusted with his location, but unable to change it for a better without friends in his own class, for he was the only gentleman then resident in the new township, to relieve the monotony of his existence with their society, or to afford him advice or assistance in his difficulties, the fatal whiskey bottle became his refuge from gloomy thoughts. His wife, an amiable and devoted creature, well-born, well-educated, and deserving of a better lot, did all in her power to wean him from the growing vice. But, alas, the pleadings of an angel in such circumstances would have had little effect upon the mind of such a man. He loved her as well as he could love anything, and he fancied that he loved his children, while he was daily reducing them, by his favourite vice, to beggary. For a while he confined his excesses to his own fireside, but this was only for as long a period as the sale of his stock and land would supply him with the means of criminal indulgence. After a time, all these resources failed, and his large grant of 800 acres of land had been converted into whiskey, except the 100 acres on which his house and barn stood, embracing the small clearing from which the family derived their scanty supply of wheat and potatoes. For the sake of peace, his wife gave up all her ornaments and household plate, and the best articles of a once handsome and ample wardrobe, in the hope of hiding her sorrows from the world, and keeping her husband at home. The pride that had rendered him so obnoxious to his humbler neighbours yielded at length to the inordinate craving for drink. The man who had held himself so high above his honest and industrious fellow settlers could now unblushingly enter their cabins and beg for a drop of whiskey. The feeling of shame once subdued, there was no end to his audacious mendacity. His whole time was spent in wandering about the country, calling upon every new settler, in the hope of being asked to partake of the coveted poison. He was even known to enter by the window of an emigrant's cabin during the absence of the owner, and remain drinking in the house while a drop of spirits could be found in the cupboard. When driven forth by the angry owner of the hut, he wandered on to the distant town of P , and lived there in a low tavern, while his wife and children were starving at home. "He is the filthiest beast in the township," said the aforementioned neighbour to me. "It would be a good thing for his wife and children if his worthless neck were broken in one of his drunken sprees." This might be the melancholy fact, but it was not the less dreadful on that account. The husband of an affectionate wife, the father of a lovely family, and his death to be a matter of rejoicing, a blessing instead of being an affliction, an agony not to be thought upon without the deepest sorrow. It was at this melancholy period of her sad story that Mrs. N found, in Jenny Buchanan, a help in her hour of need. The heart of the faithful creature bled for the misery which involved the wife of her degraded master, and the children she so dearly loved. Their want and destitution called all the sympathies of her ardent nature into active operation. They were long indebted to her labour for every morsel of food which they consumed. For them she sowed, she planted, she reaped. Every block of wood which shed a cheering warmth around their desolate home was cut from the forest by her own hands, and brought up a steep hill to the house upon her back. For them she coaxed the neighbours, with whom she was a general favourite, out of many a mess of eggs for their especial benefit, while with her cheerful songs and hearty, hopeful disposition, she dispelled much of the cramping despair which chilled the heart of the unhappy mother in her deserted home. For several years did this great poor woman keep the wolf from the door of her beloved mistress, toiling for her with the strength and energy of a man. When was man ever so devoted, so devoid of all selfishness, so attached to employers, yet poorer than herself, as this uneducated Irishwoman? A period was at length put to her unrequited services. In a fit of intoxication, her master beat her severely with the iron ramrod of his gun, and turned her with abusive language from his doors. Oh, hard return for all her unpaid labours of love! She forgave this outrage, for the sake of the helpless beings who depended upon her care. He repeated the injury, and the poor creature returned almost heartbroken to her former home. Thinking that his spite would subside in a few days, Jenny made a third effort to enter his house in her usual capacity; but Mrs. N told her, with many tears, that her presence would only enrage her husband, who had threatened herself with the most cruel treatment if she allowed the faithful servant again to enter the house. Thus ended her 5 years' service to this ungrateful master. Such was her reward. I heard of Jenny's worth and kindness from the Englishman who had been so grievously affronted by Captain N, and sent for her to come to me. She instantly accepted my offer, and returned with my messenger. She had scarcely a garment to cover her. I was obliged to find her a suit of clothes before I could set her to work. The smiles and dimples of my curly-headed, rosy little Donald, then a baby boy of 15 months, consoled the old woman for her separation from Ellie N, and the good will with which all the children, now 4 in number, regarded the kind old body, soon endeared her to the new home which Providence had assigned to her. Her accounts of Mrs. N and her family soon deeply interested me in her fate, and Jenny never went to visit her friends in Dummer without an interchange of good wishes passing between us. The year of the Canadian Rebellion came, and brought with it sorrow into many a bush dwelling. Old Jenny and I were left alone with the little children in the depths of the dark forest, to help ourselves in the best way we could. Men could not be procured in that thinly settled spot for love nor money, and I now fully realised the extent of Jenny's usefulness. Daily she yoked the oxen, and brought down from the bush fuel to maintain our fires, which she felled and chopped up with her own hands. She fed the cattle, and kept all things snug about the doors, not forgetting to load her master's 2 guns, in case, as she said, the ribbles should attack us in our retreat. The months of November and December of 1838 had been unnaturally mild for this iron climate, but the opening of the ensuing January brought a short but severe spell of frost and snow. We felt very lonely in our solitary dwelling, crouching round the blazing fire that scarcely chased the cold from our miserable log tenement, until this dreary period was suddenly cheered by the unexpected presence of my beloved friend Amelia, who came to spend a week with me in my forest home. She brought her own baby boy with her, and an ample supply of buffalo robes, not forgetting a treat of baker's bread and sweeties for the children. Oh, dear Amelia! Best and kindest of women, though absent in your native land, long, long shall my heart cherish with affectionate gratitude all your visits of love, and turn to you as to a sister, tried and found most faithful in the dark hour of adversity, and amidst the almost total neglect of those from whom nature claimed a tenderer and holier sympathy. Great was the joy of Jenny at this accession to our family party, and after Mrs. S was well warmed and had partaken of tea, the only refreshment we could offer her, we began to talk over the news of the place. "By the bye, Jenny," said she, turning to the old servant who was undressing the little boy by the fire, "have you heard lately from poor Mrs. N? We have been told that she and the family are in a dreadful state of destitution. That worthless man has left them for the States, and it is supposed that he has joined Mackenzie's band of ruffians on Navy Island. But whether this be true or false, he has deserted his wife and children, taking his eldest son along with him, who might have been of some service at home, and leaving them without money or food." "The good Lord! What will become of the creathers?" responded Jenny, wiping her wrinkled cheek with the back of her hard brown hand. "And then they have not a soul to chop and draw them firewood, and the weather so uncommon severe. Och hone! What has not that baste of a man to answer for?" "I heard," continued Mrs. S , "that they have tasted no food but potatoes for the last 9 months, and scarcely enough of them to keep soul and body together; that they have sold their last cow, and the poor young lady and her second brother, a lad of only 12 years old, bring all the wood for the fire from the bush on a hand sleigh. Oh dear! oh dear!" sobbed Jenny, "and I not there to help them, and poor Miss Mary, the tender thing. Oh, 'tis hard, terribly hard upon the creathers, and they not used to the like." "Can nothing be done for them?" said I. "That is what we want to know," returned Amelia, "and that was one of my reasons for coming up to D . I wanted to consult you and Jenny upon the subject; you, who are an officer's wife, and I, who am both an officer's wife and daughter, ought to devise some plan of rescuing this poor unfortunate lady and her family from her present forlorn situation." The tears sprang to my eyes, and I thought, in the bitterness of my heart, upon my own galling poverty, that my pockets did not contain even a single copper, and that I had scarcely garments enough to shield me from the inclemency of the weather. By unflinching industry, and taking my part in the toil of the field, I had bread for myself and family, and this was more than poor Mrs. N possessed; but it appeared impossible for me to be of any assistance to the unhappy sufferer, and the thought of my incapacity gave me severe pain. It was only in moments like the present that I felt the curse of poverty. "Well," continued my friend, "you see, Mrs. Moodie, that the ladies of P are all anxious to do what they can for her, but they first want to learn if the miserable circumstances in which she is said to be placed are true. In short, my dear friend, they want you and me to make a pilgrimage to Dummer, to see the poor lady herself, and then they will be guided by our report." "Then let us lose no time in going upon our own mission of mercy." "Och, my dear heart, you will be lost in the woods," said old Jenny. "It is 9 long miles to the first clearing, and that through a lonely blazed path. After you are through the beaver meadow, there is not a single hut for you to rest or warm yourselves. It is too much for the both of yees. You will be frozen to death on the road." "No fear," said my benevolent friend. "God will take care of us, Jenny. It is on his errand we go, to carry a message of hope to one about to perish." "The Lord bless you for a darlint," cried the old woman, devoutly kissing the velvet cheek of the little fellow sleeping upon her lap. "May your own purty child never know the want and sorrow that is around her." Emilia and I talked over the Dummer scheme until we fell asleep. Many were the plans we proposed for the immediate relief of the unfortunate family. Early the next morning, my brother-in-law, Mr. T , called upon my friend. The subject next to our heart was immediately introduced, and he was called into the general council. His feelings, like our own, were deeply interested, and he proposed that we should each provide something from our own small stores to satisfy the pressing wants of the distressed family, while he promised to bring his cutter the next morning, and take us through the beaver meadow and to the edge of the great swamp, which would shorten 4 miles at least of our long and hazardous journey. We joyfully acceded to his proposal, and set cheerfully to work to provide for the morrow. Jenny baked a batch of her very best bread, and boiled a large piece of beef, and Mr. T brought with him, the next day, a fine cooked ham in a sack, into the bottom of which he stowed the beef and loaves, besides some sugar and tea, which his own kind wife, the author of The Backwoods of Canada, had sent. I had some misgivings as to the manner in which these good things could be introduced to the poor lady, who, I had heard, was reserved and proud. "Oh, Jenny," I said, "how shall I be able to ask her to accept provisions from strangers? I am afraid of wounding her feelings." "Oh, darlin', never fear that. She is proud, I know, but 'tis not a stiff pride, but jist enough to conceal her distress from her ignorant English neighbours, who think so meanly of poor folk like her, who were once rich. She will be very thankful to you for your kindness, for she has not experienced much of it from the Dummer people in her trouble, though she may have no words to tell you so. Say that old Jenny sent the bread to dear wee Ellie, 'cause she knew she would like a loaf of Jenny's bacon." "But the meat?" "Och, the mate, is it? May be you'll think of some excuse for the mate when you get there." "I hope so, but I'm a sad coward with strangers, and I have lived so long out of the world that I am at a great loss what to do. I will try and put a good face on the matter. Your name, Jenny, will be no small help to me." All was now ready. Kissing our little bairns, who crowded around us with eager and inquiring looks, and charging Jenny for the 100th time to take especial care of them during our absence, we mounted the cutter, and set off under the care and protection of Mr. T , who determined to accompany us on the journey. It was a black, cold day, no sun visible in the grey dark sky, a keen wind, and hard frost. We crouched close to each other. "Good heavens, how cold it is!" whispered Emilia. "What a day for such a journey!" She had scarcely ceased speaking when the cutter went upon a stump which lay concealed under the drifted snow, and we, together with the ruins of our conveyance, were scattered around. "A bad beginning," said my brother-in-law with a rueful aspect, as he surveyed the wreck of the cutter from which we had promised ourselves so much benefit. "There is no help for it but to return home." "Oh, no," said Mrs. S . "Bad beginnings make good endings, you know. Let us go on. It will be far better walking than riding such a dreadful day. My feet are half frozen already, with sitting still." "But, my dear madam," expostulated Mr. T , "consider the distance, the road, the dark, dull day, and our imperfect knowledge of the path. I will get the cutter mended to morrow, and the day after we may be able to proceed." "Delays are dangerous," said the pertinacious Emilia, who, woman-like, was determined to have her own way. "Now or never. While we wait for the broken cutter, the broken-hearted Mrs. N may starve. We can stop at Colonel C 's and warm ourselves, and you can leave the cutter at his house until our return." "It was upon your account that I proposed the delay," said the good Mr. T , taking the sack, which was no inconsiderable weight, upon his shoulder, and driving his horse before him into neighbour W 's stable. "Where you go, I am ready to follow." When we arrived, Colonel C 's family were at breakfast, of which they made us partake, and after vainly endeavouring to dissuade us from what appeared to them our quixotic expedition, Mrs. C added a dozen fine white fish to the contents of the sack, and sent her youngest son to help Mr. T along with his burthen, and to bear us company on our desolate road. Leaving the Colonel's hospitable house on our left, we again plunged into the woods, and after a few minutes' brisk walking, found ourselves upon the brow of a steep bank that overlooked the beaver meadow, containing within its area several hundred acres. There is no scenery in the bush that presents such a novel appearance as those meadows or openings surrounded as they invariably are by dark, intricate forests, their high, rugged banks covered with the light, airy tamarack and silver birch. In summer they look like a lake of soft, rich verdure, hidden in the bosom of the barren and howling waste. Lakes they certainly have been, from which the waters have receded ages, ages long ago, and still the whole length of these curious level valleys is traversed by a stream of no inconsiderable dimensions. The waters of the narrow, rapid creek, which flowed through the meadow we were about to cross, were of sparkling brightness and icy cold. The Frost King had no power to check their swift, dancing movements, or stop their perpetual song. On they leapt, sparkling and flashing beneath their ice-crowned banks, rejoicing as they revelled on in their lonely course. In the prime of the year, this is a wild and lovely spot. The grass is of the richest green, and the flowers of the most gorgeous dyes. The gayest butterflies float above them upon painted wings, and the whippoorwill pours forth from the neighbouring woods, at close of dewy eve, his strange, but sadly plaintive cry. Winter was now upon the earth, and the once green meadow looked like a small forest lake covered with snow. The first step we made into it plunged us up to the knees in the snow, which was drifted to a great height in the open space. Mr. T and our young friend C walked on ahead of us in order to break a track through the untrodden snow. We soon reached the cold creek, but here a new difficulty presented itself. It was too wide to jump across, and we could see no other way of passing to the other side. "There must be some sort of a bridge hereabout," said young C, "or how can the people from Dummer pass constantly during the winter to and fro? I will go along the bank, and halloo to you if I find one." In a few minutes he gave the desired signal, and on reaching the spot we found a round, slippery log flung across the stream by way of bridge. With some trouble, and after various slips, we got safely on the other side. To wet our feet would have been to ensure their being frozen, and as it was, we were not without serious apprehension on that score. After crossing the bleak, snowy plain, we scrambled over another brook and entered the great swamp, which occupied 2 miles of our dreary road. It would be vain to attempt giving any description of this tangled maze of closely interwoven cedars, fallen trees, and loose scattered masses of rock. It seemed the fitting abode of wolves and bears, and every other unclean beast. The fire had run through it during the summer, making the confusion doubly confused. Now we stooped, half doubled, to crawl under fallen branches that hung over our path. Then again we had to clamber over prostrate trees of great bulk, descending from which we plumped down into holes in the snow, sinking mid-leg into the rotten trunk of some treacherous decayed pine tree. Before we were half through the great swamp, we began to think ourselves sad fools, and to wish that we were safe again by our own firesides. But then a great object was in view, the relief of a distressed fellow creature, and, like the full of hope misnamed forlorn, we determined to overcome every difficulty and toil on. It took us an hour at least to clear the great swamp, from which we emerged into a fine wood, composed chiefly of maple trees. The sun had, during our immersion in the dark shades of the swamp, burst through his leaden shroud, and cast a cheery gleam along the rugged boles of the lofty trees. The squirrel and chipmunk occasionally bounded across our path. The dazzling snow which covered it reflected the branches above us in an endless variety of dancing shadows. Our spirits rose in proportion. Young C burst out singing, and Amelia and I laughed and chatted as we bounded along our narrow road. On for hours, the same interminable forest stretched away to the right and left, before and behind us. "It is past 12," said my brother T thoughtfully. "If we do not soon come to a clearing, we may chance to spend the night in the forest." "Oh, I am dying with hunger," cried Amelia. Do, C, give us 1 or 2 of the cakes your mother put into the bag for us to eat upon the road." The ginger cakes were instantly produced, but where were the teeth to be found that could masticate them? The cakes were frozen as hard as stones. This was a great disappointment to us tired and hungry whites, but it only produced a hearty laugh. Over the logs we went again, for it was a perpetual stepping up and down, crossing the fallen trees that obstructed our path. At last we came to a spot where 2 distinct blazed roads diverged. "What are we to do now?" said Mr. T. We stopped, and a general consultation was held, and without one dissenting voice we took the branch to the right, which, after pursuing for about half a mile, led us to a log hut of the rudest description. "Is this the road to Dummer?" we asked a man who was chopping wood outside the fence. "I guess you are in Dummer," was the answer. My heart leapt for joy, for I was dreadfully fatigued. "Does this road lead through the English line?" "That's another thing," returned the woodman. "No, you turned off from the right path when you came up here." We all looked very blank at each other. "You will have to go back and keep the other road, and that will lead you straight to the English line." "How many miles is it to Mrs. N.'s?" "Some 4 or thereabouts," was the cheering rejoinder. "'Tis one of the last clearings on the line. If you are going back to Douro to-night, you must look sharp." Sadly and dejectedly we retraced our steps. There are few trifling failures more bitter in our journey through life than that of a tired traveller mistaking his road. What effect must that tremendous failure produce upon the human mind, when at the end of life's unretraceable journey the traveller finds that he has fallen upon the wrong track through every stage, and instead of arriving at a land of blissful promise, sinks for ever into the gulf of despair. The distance we had trodden in the wrong path, while led on by hope and anticipation, now seemed to double in length, as with painful steps we toiled on to reach the right road. This object once attained, soon led us to the dwellings of men. Neat, comfortable log houses, surrounded by well-fenced patches of clearing, arose on either side of the forest road. Dogs flew out and barked at us, and children ran shouting indoors to tell their respective owners that strangers were passing their gates; a most unusual circumstance, I should think, in that location. A servant who had hired 2 years with my brother-in-law, we knew must live somewhere in this neighbourhood, at whose fireside we hoped not only to rest and warm ourselves, but to obtain something to eat. On going up to one of the cabins to inquire for Hannah J., we fortunately happened to light upon the very person we sought. With many exclamations of surprise, she ushered us into her neat and comfortable log dwelling. A blazing fire, composed of 2 huge logs, was roaring up the wide chimney, and the savoury smell that issued from a large pot of pea soup was very agreeable to our cold and hungry stomachs. But alas! the refreshment went no further. Hannah most politely begged us to take seats by the fire, and warm and rest ourselves. She even knelt down and assisted in rubbing our half-frozen hands, but she never once made mention of the hot soup or of the tea, which was drawing in a tin teapot upon the hearthstone, or of a glass of whiskey, which would have been thankfully accepted by our male pilgrims. Hannah was not an Irishwoman, no, nor a Scotch lassie, or her very first request would have been for us to take a pickle of soup, or a sup of the warm broths. The soup was no doubt cooking for Hannah's husband and 2 neighbours, who were chopping for him in the bush, and whose want of punctuality she feelingly lamented. As we left her cottage and jogged on, Emilia whispered, laughing, "I hope you are satisfied with your good dinner. Was not the pea soup excellent? And that cup of nice hot tea? I never relished anything more in my life. I think we should never pass that house without giving Hannah a call, and testifying our gratitude for her good cheer." Many times did we stop to inquire the way to Mrs. N.'s before we ascended the steep bleak hill upon which her house stood. At the door, Mr. T deposited the sack of provisions, and he and young C went across the road to the house of an English settler, who, fortunately for them, proved more hospitable than Hannah J., to wait until our errand was executed. The house before which Emilia and I were standing had once been a tolerably comfortable log dwelling. It was larger than such buildings generally are, and was surrounded by dilapidated barns and stables, which were not cheered by a solitary head of cattle. A black pine forest stretched away to the north of the house, and terminated in a dismal, tangled cedar swamp, the entrance to the house not having been constructed to face the road. The spirit that had borne me up during the journey died within me. I was fearful that my visit would be deemed an impertinent intrusion. I knew not in what manner to introduce myself, and my embarrassment had been greatly increased by Mrs. S declaring that I must break the ice, for she had not courage to go in. I remonstrated, but she was firm. To hold any longer parley was impossible. We were standing on the top of a bleak hill, with the thermometer many degrees below zero, and exposed to the fiercest biting of the bitter, cutting blast. With a heavy sigh, I knocked slowly but decidedly at the crazy door. I saw the curly head of a boy glance for a moment against the broken window. There was a stir within, but no one answered our summons. Emilia was rubbing her hands together, and beating a rapid tattoo with her feet upon the hard and glittering snow, to keep them from freezing. Again I appealed to the inhospitable door, with a vehemence which seemed to say, "We are freezing, good people; in mercy let us in." Again there was a stir, and a whispered sound of voices, as if in consultation, from within; and after waiting a few minutes longer, which, cold as we were, seemed an age, the door was cautiously opened by a handsome, dark-eyed lad of 12 years of age, who was evidently the owner of the curly head that had been sent to reconnoitre us through the window. Carefully closing the door after him, he stepped out upon the snow, and asked us coldly but respectfully what we wanted. I told him that we were two ladies who had walked all the way from Douro to see his mamma, and that we wished very much to speak to her. The lad answered us with the ease and courtesy of a gentleman, that he did not know whether his mamma could be seen by strangers, but he would go in and see. So saying, he abruptly left us, leaving behind him an ugly skeleton of a dog, who, after expressing his disapprobation at our presence, in the most disagreeable and unequivocal manner, pounced like a famished wolf upon the sack of good things which lay at Emilia's feet, and our united efforts could scarcely keep him off. "A cold, doubtful reception this," said my friend, turning her back to the wind, and hiding her face in her muff. "This is worse than Hannah's liberality, and the long, weary walk." I thought so too, and began to apprehend that our walk had been in vain, when the lad again appeared, and said that we might walk in, for his mother was dressed. Emilia, true to her determination, went no further than the passage. In vain were all my entreating looks and mute appeals to her benevolence and friendship. I was forced to enter alone the apartment that contained the distressed family. I felt that I was treading upon sacred ground, for a pitying angel hovers over the abode of suffering virtue, and hallows all its woes. On a rude bench before the fire sat a lady between 30 and 40 years of age, dressed in a thin coloured muslin gown, the most inappropriate garment for the rigour of the season, but in all probability the only decent one that she retained. A subdued melancholy looked forth from her large, dark, pensive eyes. She appeared like one who, having discovered the full extent of her misery, had proudly steeled her heart to bear it. Her countenance was very pleasing, and in early life, but she was still young, she must have been eminently handsome. Near her, with her head bent down, and shaded by her thin, slender hand, her slight figure scarcely covered by her scanty clothing, sat her eldest daughter, a gentle, sweet-looking girl, who held in her arms a baby brother, whose destitution she endeavoured to conceal. It was a touching sight, that suffering girl, just stepping into womanhood, hiding against her young bosom the nakedness of the little creature she loved. Another fine boy, whose neatly patched clothes had not one piece of the original stuff apparently left in them, stood behind his mother, with dark glistening eyes fastened upon me, as if amused, and wondering who I was, and what business I could have there. A pale and attenuated, but very pretty, delicately featured little girl was seated on a low stool before the fire. This was old Jenny's darling Ellie, or Eloise. A rude bedstead, of home manufacture, in a corner of the room, covered with a coarse woollen quilt, contained two little boys, who had crept into it to conceal their wants from the eyes of the stranger. On the table lay a dozen peeled potatoes, and a small pot was boiling on the fire to receive their scanty and only daily meal. There was such an air of patient and enduring suffering to the whole group, that, as I gazed heart-stricken upon it, my fortitude quite gave way, and I burst into tears. Mrs. N first broke the painful silence, and, rather proudly, asked me to whom she had the pleasure of speaking. I made a desperate effort to regain my composure, and told her, but with much embarrassment, my name, adding that I was so well acquainted with her and her children, through Jenny, that I could not consider her as a stranger; that I hoped that, as I was the wife of an officer, and, like her, a resident in the bush, and well acquainted with all its trials and privations, she would look upon me as a friend. She seemed surprised and annoyed, and I found no small difficulty in introducing the object of my visit; but the day was rapidly declining, and I knew that not a moment was to be lost. At first she coldly rejected all offers of service, and said that she was contented and wanted for nothing. I appealed to the situation in which I beheld herself and her children, and implored her for their sakes not to refuse help from friends who felt for her distress. Her maternal feelings triumphed over her assumed indifference, and when she saw me weeping, for I could no longer restrain my tears, her pride yielded, and for some minutes not a word was spoken. I heard the large tears, as they slowly fell from her daughter's eyes, drop one by one upon her garments. At last the poor girl sobbed out, "Dear mamma, why conceal the truth? You know that we are nearly naked, and starving." Then came the sad tale of domestic woes; the absence of the husband and eldest son, the uncertainty as to where they were, or in what engaged, the utter want of means to procure the common necessaries of life, the sale of the only remaining cow that used to provide the children with food. It had been sold for $12, part to be paid in cash, part in potatoes. The potatoes were nearly exhausted, and they were allowanced to so many a day, but the $6 she had retained as their last resource. Alas! she had sent the eldest boy the day before to P to get a letter out of the post office, which she hoped contained some tidings of her husband and son. She was all anxiety and expectation, but the child returned late at night, without the letter which they had longed for with such feverish impatience. The $6 upon which they had depended for a supply of food were in notes of the farmer's bank, which at that time would not pass for money, and which the roguish purchaser of the cow had passed off upon this distressed family. Oh, imagine, ye who revel in riches, who can daily throw away a large sum upon the merest toy, the cruel disappointment, the bitter agony of this poor mother's heart, when she received this calamitous news, in the midst of her starving children. For the last 9 weeks they had lived upon a scanty supply of potatoes. They had not tasted bread or animal food for 18 months. "Ellie," said I, anxious to introduce the sack, which had lain like a nightmare upon my mind, "I have something for you. Jenny baked some loaves last night, and sent them to you with her best love." The eyes of all the children grew bright. "You will find the sack with the bread in the passage," said I to one of the boys. He rushed joyfully out, and returned with Mrs. and the sack. Her bland and affectionate greeting restored us all to tranquillity. The delighted boy opened the sack. The first thing he produced was the ham. "Oh," said I, "that is a ham that my sister sent to Mrs. N. 'Tis of her own curing, and she thought that it might be acceptable." Then came the white fish, nicely packed in a clean cloth. Mrs. C thought fish might be a treat to Mrs. N, as she lived so far from the Great Lakes. Then came Jenny's bread, which had already been introduced. The beef and tea and sugar fell upon the floor without any comment. The first scruples had been overcome, and the day was ours. "And now, ladies," said Mrs. N with true hospitality, "since you have brought refreshments with you, permit me to cook something for your dinner." The scene I had just witnessed had produced such a choking sensation that all my hunger had vanished. Before we could accept or refuse Mrs. N 's kind offer, Mr. T arrived to hurry us off. It was 2 o'clock when we descended the hill in front of the house, that led by a side path round to the road, and commenced our homeward route. I thought the 4 miles of clearings would never be passed, and the English line appeared to have no end. At length we entered once more the dark forest. The setting sun gleamed along the ground. The necessity of our exerting our utmost speed, and getting through the great swamp before darkness surrounded us, was apparent to all. The men strode vigorously forward, for they had been refreshed with a substantial dinner of potatoes and pork, washed down with a glass of whiskey at the cottage in which they had waited for us. But poor Emilia and I, faint, hungry, and footsore, it was with the greatest difficulty we could keep up. I thought of Rosalind as our march up and down the fallen logs recommenced, and often exclaimed with her, "Oh, Jupiter, how weary are my legs!" Night closed in just as we reached the beaver meadow. Here our ears were greeted with the sound of well-known voices. James and Henry C. had brought the ox sleigh to meet us at the edge of the bush. Never was splendid equipage greeted with such delight. Emilia and I, now fairly exhausted with fatigue, scrambled into it, and lying down on the straw which covered the bottom of the rude vehicle, we drew the buffalo robes over our faces, and actually slept soundly until we reached Colonel C.'s hospitable door. An excellent supper of hot fish and fried venison was smoking on the table, with other good cheer, to which we did ample justice. I, for one, was never so hungry in my life. We had fasted for 12 hours, and that on an intensely cold day, and had walked during that period upwards of 20 miles. Never, never shall I forget that weary walk to Dummer. But a blessing followed it. It was midnight when Emilia and I reached my humble home, our good friends the oxen being again put in requisition to carry us there. Emilia went immediately to bed, from which she was unable to rise for several days. In the meanwhile I wrote to Moodie an account of the scene I had witnessed, and he raised a subscription among the officers of the regiment for the poor lady and her children, which amounted to $40. Emilia lost no time in making a full report to her friends at P, and before a week passed away, Mrs. N and her family were removed thither by several benevolent individuals in the place. A neat cottage was hired for her, and, to the honour of Canada be it spoken, all who could afford a donation gave cheerfully. Farmers left at her door pork, beef, flour, and potatoes. The storekeepers sent groceries and goods to make clothes for the children. The shoemakers contributed boots for the boys, while the ladies did all in their power to assist and comfort the gentle creature thus thrown by Providence upon their bounty. While Mrs. N remained at P, she did not want for any comfort. Her children were clothed, and her rent paid by her benevolent friends, and her house supplied with food and many comforts from the same source. Respected and beloved by all who knew her, it would have been well had she never left the quiet asylum where for several years she enjoyed tranquillity and a respectable competence from her school, but in an evil hour she followed her worthless husband to the Southern States, and again suffered all the woes which drunkenness inflicts upon the wives and children of its degraded victims. The Convict's Wife. Pale matron, I see thee in agony steep, the pillow on which thy young innocents sleep, their slumbers are tranquil, unbroken their rest. They know not the grief that convulses thy breast. They mark not the glance of that red, swollen eye, that must weep till the fountain of sorrow is dry. They guess not thy thoughts in this moment of dread, thou desolate widow, but not of the dead. Ah, what are thy feelings, whilst gazing on those who unconsciously smile in their balmy repose, the pangs which thy grief-stricken bosom must prove, whilst gazing through tears on those pledges of love, who murmur in slumber the dear cherished name of that sire who has covered his offspring with shame, of that husband whom justice has wrenched from thy side, of the wretch who the laws of his country defied. Poor heart-broken mourner, thy tears faster flow, time can bring no oblivion to banish thy woe. The sorrows of others are softened by years, ah, what now remains for thy portion but tears? Anxieties ceaseless, renewed day by day, while thy heart yearns for one who is ever away. To hope speeds thy thoughts as they traverse the wave, to the far distant land of the exile and slave. And those children whose birth with such rapture was hailed, when the holiest feelings of nature prevailed, and the bright drops that moistened the father's glad cheek could alone the deep transport of happiness speak, when he turned from his first-born with glances of pride, in grateful devotion to gaze on his bride, the loved and the loving, who, silent with joy, alternately gazed from the sire to his boy. Ah, what could induce the young husband to fling love's garland away in life's beautiful spring, to scatter the roses hope wreathed for her brow in the dust, and abandon his partner to woe? The wine-cup can answer, the bacchanal's bowl corrupted life's chalice, and poisoned his soul. It chilled the warm heart, added fire to the brain, gave to pleasure and passion unbridled the rein, till the endearments of children and wife only roused the fell demon to anger and strife. By conscience deserted, by law unrestrained, a felon convicted, unblushing and chained, too late from the dark dream of ruin he woke, to remember the wife whose fond heart he had broke. The children abandoned to sorrow and shame, their deepest misfortune the brand of his name. Oh, dire was the curse he invoked on his soul, then gave his last mite for a draught of the bowl. End of chapter 25.